Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. This is Marty Kaiser with our latest episode of Marty Kaiser's Real Estate Tidbits podcast, Live the Dream. I wanted to cover a few things today that hopefully will be of tremendous interest to everyone. As you know, we've been spending a lot of time on all these procedural and legal updates in real estate, and I know it can be dry sometimes, but I wanted to give you my experience in the first week or so of having these in the Orlando area and give you some interesting information about them. Number one, there's a lot of what I call lack of uniformity. So right now, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of brokers are doing different things, using different forms, recommending different procedures. So it's a little bit convoluted. Hopefully, when you do make a real estate decision or you get information from an agent or a broker, they will be doing the most correct and up-to-date and thorough procedures. For myself and my company's procedures, not only are we trying to do what we think are the most consumer-friendly, but also comply with the Justice Department's recommendations on how they want realtors to operate nationally in terms of discussing fees, discussing representation, making it as transparent as possible, and making it hopefully so it's more understandable to both sellers and buyers. So I just wanted to mention that. We have generated some new paperwork that we're using that we think is going to be very beneficial to everybody, and we're making sure that all our agents on our company level utilize it. Myself, I've always done something similar, and I'm probably even more increasing this. So when I have a potential buyer who wants me to represent them, I try to have what I call a consultation with them. And what does a consultation mean from my perspective? Well, I kind of go over everything from A to Z about what they should expect in the process, all the different things that I'm going to do for them, and how I'm going to best achieve their objectives in not only finding them the right real estate, getting them the best price and terms, accomplishing that in the most stress-free manner, giving them my unsolicited advice in many cases on what I think is going to be, from my perspective, the best policies to benefit their interest. So I go over a lot of those things, and I do that intentionally because, number one, I want to make sure that the customer and myself are aligned, meaning that the recommendations and information that I'm providing them, not only are they comfortable with it, but they fully understand it, and they feel that I'm the best person to accomplish their objectives. Secondly, I want them to understand all the time, effort, and value that they receive from me, because a lot of times I think previously a lot of people were not 100% aware of all the things that a skilled agent broker does on behalf of the customer that they don't see. For example, I'll give you a little bit of time elements with myself. I pretty much accept calls 7 days a week. I take calls in the evenings. When a customer of mine has questions or doesn't understand something, I try to call them immediately and walk them through it, make sure I answer their questions so they're comfortable with it. I believe when you disseminate information, there's only so much you can do with texting. Obviously, a lot of people nowadays text, and I certainly text, but I try to limit my texting to more simple concepts. When it comes to more details, more potential misunderstandings, more questions from my customer, I fully believe that a telephone call or an in-person meeting is by far the best way to accomplish that. And at the end of the day, when a customer hires me, I want them not only to feel comfortable, but that they're getting superior real estate skills and what I call the value proposition, that they're getting a tremendous arrangement that's going to benefit them, and they're going to be completely happy with that. And I've always done that, obviously, with sellers, because with sellers, you've always had to legally have them sign paperwork to hire you. And so you've outlined exactly your recommendations, how you arrived at that, what the fees would be in a transaction, what potential pitfalls a seller might run into, those sorts of things. With a buyer, it was a lot less formalized with a lot of agents, so they really didn't have a good understanding on what a quality agent would do. So I've always endeavored to communicate those services, but I go to additional detail now to make sure that my customer is 100% clear on what I do. Now, one of the things that I've run into over the past several years on transactions, particularly when I'm representing sellers, and I thought it would flow with what we're covering today, is the concept of what we call open permits. This was something that changed in Orange County, Orlando area, approximately 10 years ago, where as part of the closing process, from the time that you got a sales contract until you went to closing, the title company, as part of their normal services, besides checking for liens and is there a mortgage on the property and different things that you would expect, they also checked to see if all permits were properly closed. The confusing thing about this for a lot of sellers were two things. Number one, they go back for the history of the property. So for exact, I'm running into a transaction now in Hunters Creek where the property was built in 1994, and my particular seller has only owned the home for approximately 13 years. So when they bought the property back in 2010-11 timeframe, Orange County, or the title companies, I should say, they were not checking for open permits. So it was a non-issue. Nobody really got involved in that. When these changes took place a few years after that, it's become an issue potentially on every transaction, because if there's open permits, it means they weren't properly closed by the contractor who made an improvement in the house. This could be as simple as building a fence, or it could be more involved as installing a new roof, installing a new in-ground pool, installing a new screen enclosure, and everything else in between. So what happens in these situations is if there are an open permit, typically the title company, of course, would notify both the seller and the buyer, and the seller is going to expect, in most instances, for the seller to rectify that open permit. Some open permits are relatively simple to handle, and I can do that with some of the contacts I have with the permitting department in Orange County. Others, unfortunately, not so easy. You have to go back through and actually pull a new permit, get that particular permitting services re-inspected. And if the permitting department didn't like the way the work was done, they could theoretically make the seller make changes to that particular component. For example, if there was something about the electric in a pool construction, they could require that to be changed. So you never know 100%. So the reason I bring that up is I've always attempted to be proactive with that. So when I get an interview with a seller and the seller is interviewing me about selling their home, prior to me meeting with them, I automatically pull all the permits, because I want to ensure at the beginning of our meeting, are there any open permits that I need to discuss with that seller? And if there are open permits, then I need to kind of explain in a little bit more detail than I'm doing on this podcast what could be involved and how I would recommend that we try to close that out to minimize any kind of headaches and to possibly delay closing. I always do it up front because we have more time and less pressure. And fortunately, I've been pretty successful in navigating this landscape. And a lot of times the sellers obviously are caught completely unaware, and they say, well, you're telling me about something that took place in 1998, and I didn't own the house then, so why is it my problem? Well, then I have to explain to them that unfortunately they don't grandfather those in, so the permitting department or the zoning department doesn't really care if the current seller was not the owner when that permit was pulled and not properly handled. Secondly, if we wait until the house is under contract and then the title company notifies both buyer and seller that there is a permitting issue, if for some reason it's one of these more challenging permits and the building department is not cooperating and making it a simple closeout, then we have a lot more pressure to get it closed out. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that by the time that this is all parties to the transaction are informed, we maybe have a closing coming up in 10 days or something. If we're not able to navigate through the bureaucratic maze and go through whatever Orange County is requiring and get this satisfactorily closed out, then you have the potential to delay closing. And that could be a big headache depending on the seller might be using his proceeds to buy something else. The buyer may have given notice to their rental property and need to be into the property by a certain date. So you never know exactly what kind of issues could result from this. So that's why I always endeavor to be very proactive with this. And a lot of times when I explain this to the seller, they appreciate it and they understand it. But initially they're taken aback by this because this didn't happen when they bought the house. But as I mentioned, they didn't check this a lot of times previously up until a certain amount of years ago. So it was a non-issue for people buying before a certain date. So it is an item that needs to be checked on every single transaction. And if you're representing a buyer, one thing that you should do as the buyer's agent or the buyer's representative, again, you should pull the permits. And if you see open permits, to again facilitate transparency and communication and avoid misunderstandings, when you do write an offer on behalf of a buyer, you want to reference which permits were not closed out by permit number, the date of the permit, etc. And you'll make that a condition of your offer, that those permits are closed out by the seller. So by doing it that way, the seller's not caught by surprise in case their agent has not informed them of that. At the same time, you're giving the seller more time to get that closed out, so it's not delaying your potential sale. And of course, you're fully representing your buyer's interests by disclosing that and putting it as part of your offer. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you bring that to the seller's attention and the seller says, well, that was before my ownership, I'm not closing that out. And let's say you were unable to get that seller to agree to close it out for whatever reason, even though you didn't necessarily agree with their thinking with that matter, but it's still their house and you can't force them to do anything. Well, then you would notify your customer or the buyer on that transaction that the seller refuses to close that out. So then the buyer can decide if they still want to pursue that property or not. There's nothing legally prohibiting that buyer from buying the property. It just means that they're basically assuming that open permit. So that means when they go to sell the house, whenever that is in the future, they may be required to close it out. And if they're uncomfortable with that, then they need to take a stand right now. And let's just say, I'll use an extreme case. Let's say the seller absolutely refuses to close those permits out. At the same time, your buyer is just totally uncomfortable with taking over a an issue from the past, and they say they're not going to buy the house unless the seller closes it out. Well, if that situation arose and you were unable to successfully mediate a solution between both buyer and seller, then you would not fully execute that contract. You would cancel your offer and the buyer would move on to a different property. We never like having to cancel or not finalize a contract, but it's better to do that at the beginning of the process rather than toward the end of the process where there could be more legal entanglements, more hard feelings, more disruption of plans, etc. So that's why with my personality and real estate acumen, along with how I feel is the best way to conduct business, I always do things on the front end, and that's why I always tell my customers that I always try to be as proactive as possible. And I always will do that. And hopefully my consumers will understand and appreciate that they're getting the benefit of me being so diligent on what might seem to be a boring item. Another thing that I wanted to go over today that relates to misunderstandings and miscommunications are how the media, in many cases, is explaining these changes in the real estate industry, the ramifications of these changes, and how they're explaining these things should be handled by real estate agents in a particular transaction. The other day when I was drinking my morning coffee, I had the news on, and it so happened that it was the Today Show. So they had a segment about real estate, and they had a specific segment by one of their quote-unquote real estate experts on the changes that were taking place nationally that I've been going over the past few weeks on my podcast. And anyway, to make a long story short, in my humble opinion, the Today Show's expert did a horrible job explaining the do's and don'ts of this, how it could impact people, explanation of potential fees and stuff. They basically didn't do a very accurate job of thoroughly explaining this in the proper and most concise fashion. So if you were a potential real estate customer, whether you were a seller or a buyer, and because you saw it on a national show like the Today Show, you heard their explanation, you might think, well, okay, that's the way things are being done. So depending on what side of the fence you're on and how they explained it, you might think it was benefiting you, or you might think it was something negative for you. But in any event, they did a very simplistic and inaccurate fashion. And I find in a lot of media explanations, whether they're on television, on podcasts, on the internet, they're very often not explained either accurately or properly, or they give the impression of something that's not taking place. So that's going to cause, in the short term at least, even more confusion. I just wish that with these standards that we'd have, we would all try to strive for more uniformity, which right now we're not doing. And the people that are opining on this, regardless of what part of the media that they're in, had a better understanding of this. You know, people that are quote-unquote experts but don't actually sell real estate on a daily basis are kind of removed from this. So they're opining, and they really are not in what I call the trenches, doing this on a day-to-day basis, and many times don't understand this. I kind of correlate this to what takes place in law enforcement. You know, when we get a situation that gets national publicity on what, quote, experts feel that law enforcement may or may not have done in a particular situation that got a lot of publicity, and law enforcement frequently gets the blames for some of these issues. The people opining on this were not involved in that situation, and they don't have all the facts. And these things many times get slanted Could be in favor of the police, could be in favor of the person that feels they were unjustly accused of something. And you don't really know until you know all the evidence, that you see the videos, that you actually know what took place. And unfortunately, everybody nowadays, especially on the internet, is looking for clicks. So they'll put a headline that's somewhat controversial or confrontational, and it puts one or the other segments of this confrontation in a negative light. Just like locally in Orlando, there was a case that got a lot of publicity about somebody that's suing Disney right now. They were eating in a restaurant in Disney Springs, and they suffered an allergic reaction to some food they were served, and they ultimately died from this. So the things that are being quoted right now, and I'm not giving an opinion, but just explaining how things can be misinterpreted. This was a restaurant that was not owned by Disney. However, Disney's getting sued from what they explained on the news about this. At the same time, Disney is trying to say, what's being reported, that they shouldn't be sued due to the fact that this particular plaintiff was getting the Disney Plus service on streaming on their TVs, and as part of being a recipient or a consumer of Disney Plus, the form that they signed for that order said that they have to go through mediation or arbitration in the event of a dispute. So Disney's saying, from what's being reported, that because they signed that mediation or arbitration language, that you can't sue Disney. Well, intrinsically to me, that doesn't sound logical, but I'd have to know more about it, and I'm not a lawyer. At the same token, what was never stated in this, and I'd like to have a better legal interpretation, is that Disney was only leasing this space, to my knowledge, to a restaurant operator. So why was Disney being sued, as they didn't run the restaurant, as opposed to the restaurant operator, who supposedly was told on multiple occasions by this patron that they had allergies to peanuts and some other things that were mentioned, and they were assured on multiple occasions by the server that those things would not be included in the preparation or serving of the food. So there was a lot of things that were lacking in the report that, if we had more information about it, it might be clearer as to one side or the other's position. The only thing that I can honestly say is, if I had a relative that died from an allergic reaction to food, and I was told on 2 or 3 occasions by the vendor of that food or the server of that food that they were taking every protection to make sure that those things weren't being prepared in the food, and a loved one of mine ended up passing away from that, I'd be more than extremely upset and crestfallen. Money can never bring somebody back, but of course, one of the things in that reported situation is that you want to try to ensure that that situation doesn't occur again, and put even more guardrails so that people that have allergies don't run into that risk. Seemingly, the only guarantee a person with severe allergies would have is never eating out and just preparing all their own food at home. And I'm sure that there are people with allergies that do that, but obviously a lot of people like to eat out for various reasons. So it's easy to either misreport, tell only part of the story, or not really give a fair representation or explanation of facts or logic in a particular situation. So those are just some of the things that I'm bringing those up because they have an analogy to some of the things that we're dealing in the real estate business. So anyway, hopefully this has given you some insight. The main thing is, before you enter into a real estate relationship with an agent or a broker, you should make sure that they're thoroughly explaining everything to you. They have a complete and comprehensive blueprint on how they're going to best represent your interest that correlate to your taste, budget, tastes, etc., that they fully disclose to you any fees that could be involved in the transaction, that they set a clear roadmap for you on the best way to accomplish their objectives, and that they actually explain to you a little bit more about their background and skill level and why that agent or broker is best served to represent your real estate interests. I'll close with this, that we're hearing a lot now about, and I find some of this kind of interesting, about the Olympics and specifically the USA basketball team. And as you know from my last podcast, I gave props to the USA basketball team. They won another gold medal. The foreign competition has gotten a lot stronger. So the U.S. has to work with more than just talent nowadays. And one of the things that's occurred is that there's been some criticism of the USA basketball coach, Steve Kerr, who's the basketball coach for the Golden State Warriors. He was a lot more what I call proactive and more utilizing the year 2024 and not what took place 16 years ago, meaning that the foreign competition has caught up a lot to basketball. We probably still have more talent, but the way our talent is developed, the way that our players are taught the game, and the AAU circuit in the United States has really not prepared our players to be as good students of the game and work as much in a teamwork fashion, where a lot of the foreign players are better equipped to do that. So consequently, when we get in these type of all-star / Olympic settings, it required the coach Steve Kerr to do more specific mixing and matching. In other words, not just throwing out any player on the court and expecting them to come in victorious. So he was criticized for a couple of the players not seeing much floor time, because these are all quality all-star players of the United States through the NBA. But he felt that against certain teams, matchups were critical, so he might play certain players over other players. So a lot of times the media tried to exacerbate that and not really give him his full props. I think he did a phenomenal job and should be complimented. At the same time, the last thing that he did, which I just wanted to mention, I happened to see him interviewed the other day, and he was full of praise of LeBron James, who, as you probably know, is probably the most famous player in basketball. He's been a professional now for 20 years. I believe he's 39 going on 40, and he's still a phenomenal player. His performance and skill level is unheard of at his age, and he just does an unbelievable job. Well, Steve Kerr went out of his way to compliment him on not only how good he still is, but how he's receptive to coaching, how he's a floor general on the court, how he's a team player, how he takes constructive, not necessarily criticisms, but suggestions. And I thought that was very interesting, because LeBron James has gotten a lot of media, mostly good, but some bad, because a lot of people compare him to who's perceived as the GOAT, Michael Jordan. But Michael Jordan retired 25 years ago, so the landscape and the skills required are different. So I think everybody should take the position that Michael Jordan was phenomenal, but Michael Jordan is also. LeBron James is also phenomenal, and I just wanted to recognize him as he's been a great spokesperson and player for all these years. That's all for today. Hope you found this podcast enjoyable. Live the dream. Tell all your friends and family about this. This is Marty Kaiser signing off, and have a great weekend.